Welcome to the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers and its monthly Authors and Artists Showcase. I'm your host, J.W. Capek, and today I have the pleasure of introducing an author who usually sits on this side of the table, Marshall Miller, author and screenwriter. I first met Mark at a Barnes & Noble panel for authors, and at his invitation I joined the Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers, CLAW. Mark, with all of the entertainment choices there are today for adults and children with videos and digitals and everything else, why is it still important to read a book?
How we all got started, if you go back in eons ago, we were all around the campfire and people would get up and they would tell stories. Or actually they'd start out acting out stories because it took us some millennia to develop language. But then we would tell stories. So we are storytellers. And so I always get in arguments with people about this. We are primarily storytellers. Then of course when the written language came along, what did we do? We started putting the stories into a permanent form. And so writers became storytellers. That is why you need to be able to read, because our whole history of the human species is being storytellers and putting it into writing, and everything else follows that. All
right. Since your first interview, which you did with when you were first starting the CLAW interviews, you have continued to support many local authors. You appear regularly at book sales, you promote the BCAT programming, and now you're working with Blue Forge Group. How did all these transitions from that interview to this one take place?
The whole CLAW group actually was started originally by Rebecca Bauer and Iona Buick, who wanted to form a little group kind of like just to talk about writing and filmmaking and stuff like that. So I barged my way in and said, I want to go, I want to play too. So the three of us started meeting, and then eventually we turned into kind of like this little evening meeting group where we would get as many people in there as possible. And we didn't want to be just a critique group. We wanted to be a group that would support writers, artists, filmmakers. We didn't care. Any type of creative, I call them everybody a creative. Any person who's got a least bit of creativity in their soul that want to do something. And help them figure out a way, and specifically with writing, of course, how do we get published? How do we get our books out there? With filmmaking, of course, how do we get films out there? You know, and things like this. Painters and things like that. And we started morphing it in where we started looking at various venues to try to get our wares out there, you know, and so people would be able to see them. One of the first big things we did, of course, was, I think about like it's 4 or 5 years ago now, was the Blackberry Festival in Bremerton, Washington. And as time's gone by, we've morphed it more and more and more. Like you said, we're trying to get the average person out there. We don't need somebody who is already a million book seller. Okay, what we're trying to do is help people starting out get their stuff out there. Let people read or look at their paintings or at their film or whatever they want to do so that they can actually feel like, hey, I've actually done something. I've actually created something. And now, here, look at this, you know, and hopefully you'll like it. Because I think that's basically what everybody wants to do. We want to put something out there that at least one person will walk up and say, I like that.
What skills from your previous careers translate into the discipline of writing fiction beyond just routine reports? I know you did a lot of routine reports, but now you're into a fiction world. How does that translate?
Well, what I wound up doing, going way back into ancient history, I was going to be an investigative reporter, but circumstances wound up, and before you knew it, I was in the military and then law enforcement. So 30 years later, I decided to get back into writing. When I write, a lot of the things I write about involves characters based on people I knew, in circumstances that maybe I knew of or experienced, or I knew that other people had experienced, and then weave them into an interesting story to try to make it, of course, fairly realistic. I've got a new book coming out, which is right here, Jade Eyes, which is about some of the experiences I had in my last job I had working at a federal agency over here in Seattle about human trafficking and things. So specifically with that book, I tried to get more into the nitty-gritty of the actual reality of what it means to be a federal agent, and also the whole thing about the whole law enforcement community and how they interact with each other and everything like that. So at least for me, that portion of taking your experiences and then trying to weave them into the story to make them as realistic as possible, I think that part of the writing. But of course, getting used to, like you said, writing reports and things like this, you had to write things in a certain style because they would go before a judge and then wind up in court during a trial. So you really had to make sure that what you were writing also was accurate and was reality. Now, of course, I write science fiction, so I can then take that little basis of reality and kind of go off to the right or off to the left, you know. But I also like to keep some basis of reality so people can identify with, like, oh, I knew somebody like that, you know. That's the way that they would react to such and such a situation, and try to get the reader more involved.
Well, your classic tome of science fiction is the invasion of Earth by an alien species. How do you pronounce their name?
Okay, I pronounce it a little bit of a T on the front.
Okay, Tasha.
Tasha. Maybe I could add a little accent up there. I never have. I just wrote it Tasha.
Tasha.
Yeah.
Okay. In that trilogy, the Tasha infestation, Mark asked, what would happen if a alien space species came to eat us? Now, how much can you tell us about that?
Well, it's not only just to eat, because everybody through history has written what I call the bug-eyed monster stories and the bug-eyed monster movies, especially from the 50s, where these creatures would show up and they would attack us and they would eat us, and nobody would develop the backstory of the aliens. They wouldn't develop the backstory of their culture. So what I wanted to do was to show, okay, we've got basically these aliens who look like a combination of squids and octopus, but they're a very complicated species. They have a very complicated culture, okay? And in some ways, they actually treat each other better than we treat, you know, humans treat each other. And that was part of my story, was kind of a compare contrast. Yeah, they're treating us like cattle, but they're not being quote unquote evil about us. They don't torture us. They don't do all these weird things like humans do to other humans. And in fact, one of the things I purposely put in the story, well, two of the things I put in the story was their culture was different, was the thought of one of the Tasha being cannibalistic on their own kind literally was just like, it's just complete blasphemy, you know, basically. The other thing is, the most important thing with the aliens was they're young, they're children. If somebody would harm a child, that would be, or would cause something that would harm a child, that was the ultimate sin in their culture, because everything was around their children. So if an adult Tasha did something where a child was seriously injured or died, quite often they would go catatonic and then would die. They would literally just cease living because it was such a psychic shock. So I took that and compared it to how humans treat each other. The Tasha, the last time they fought an actual war with each other was like thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And that was part of the compare contrast thing, was, okay, yeah, they invaded us and they're eating us. Does that automatically mean that we're morally superior to them?
Do you outline your plots first? This book was extensive, as you have mentioned.
Yeah.
Often it was thousands and thousands of words. Did you outline that plot first, or did your characters just kind of take over and tell you what to do?
I have a tendency of outlining stuff in my head, and I've got all these dozens of stories still bouncing around up there from various, I guess you'd call universes that I've created in the past that I've just never got around to writing about. So I outlined it kind of in my head, but once you start writing the characters, there's one character in particular. Her name was Abigail, and she was this young, basically a child warrior. She took on a life of her own, and she became one of the major characters in the story. And I say it's because these characters actually exist in a little alternate universe, like a string theory, universe over here. And they reach into your head, and they start tickling you, and they start telling you, well, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. And all of a sudden, you started out with this nice little simple story, and it starts to expand, and the character starts to expand. But it gives you the ability then, though, too, to go off on little tangents and examine other possible things about the human condition. And that's literally a lot of what I write about is my ideas about the human condition as to us as a species and how we treat each other. So that's what happens with characters. Before you know it, the story starts going off and, oh, that's where the story's going. And so then you wind up with, like I said, a character that started out as being more minor suddenly becomes huge.
How do you research that extensive use of military hardware? Some of it is antique in these books.
Yeah.
Some of it is in the fictional world. Some of it is just as off-the-counter kind of thing.
Yeah.
How did you research all that?
Well, number one, years ago I was a history major, but number two, I also spent about 7.5 years in the military, but I've always been fascinated with the fact that we, like once again, the human condition, we as a species spend so much time on weaponry and things involving weaponry and hardware. We have opposable thumbs and we're tool users, but it's really odd how we managed to then take that tool using into create all of these things that we use for destruction. So I'm fascinated by that, and I enjoy reading about it, all the various types of, like you said, military hardware and things like this, and then trying to weave it into a story to make it realistic. Once again, a lot of the problems I see, you'll read books involving either military or law enforcement, where people start using cookie cutout things, cookie cutout plots, cookie cutout comments and stuff like that. So you can tell they had never really lived the experience. And I also want to show on there too, when I'm doing the military stuff and also law enforcement, there's always going to be a level of fear in human beings. And so I always tell everybody, if you say you don't fear something, then there's something wrong, because that is a normal human reaction. And so I try to bring that in there. Fear, hate, all that stuff that makes us human. I bring all that into my stories and try to show it, I think, as realistic as possible.
I was first introduced to the T'Challa by this collection of short stories, Free Range Protocol.
Yeah.
And the tales of the T'Challa infestation. I understand that you are now composing stories for an anthology to be released in 2020. What is that anthology? Is it more of the T'Challa, or is it something else?
Yeah, I worked with my current publisher, my new publisher, Blue Forge Press, and what we did was we re-released, and this is a story here, we re-released the short stories with 6 additional new stories. Mm-hmm. Because I wound up with over 500,000 words in the War and Peace of Alien Squid Invasion novels, is what one of my editors called it. And so I wound up breaking into 3 volumes. But in any long story, especially when you have multiple characters, like War and Peace, you quite often have unanswered questions about what happened maybe later with them, or what happened before that led to this. So what I'm trying to do with the short stories is to fill in the blanks and to try to continue the story, but also show, this individual that was introduced in the original 3 volumes, this is what happened to him or her. This is also additional stories to who they are, to try to make sure they are developed as an actual, human character, not just like I said, a cookie cutout where you just kind of throw them in there for the, for the whatever for grins, and then all of a sudden the character disappears. So that's kind of what I'm doing with the short stories, is to wrap it up, but also to continue on the story of the relationship between humans and each other, and also this alien species now that is on the Earth.
Well, I'm also thinking of the short stories where you have a short story a month, you get a prompt,
Exactly.
and then you write that short story. So at the end of the year, you will have 12 more short stories.
Yes.
Are they related to this?
Well, I've actually got 2 projects in reference to that. One of them is we are going to do another anthology of short stories specifically in this universe.
Oh.
But I'm also working with my publisher and with some of the other authors that are also with Blue Forge, where we're going to be releasing some other anthologies where everybody writes short stories. And I'm writing short stories outside of this universe also. Because like I said, I've got all these ideas bouncing around in my head that some of them I formed like 30 years ago. They just kind of sat there, and I didn't get around to writing anything because I was too busy doing everything else. So now this has given me the chance to be able to re-examine all that and maybe create other universes and other storylines.
In these other storylines that you're producing, are you changing your genre? Are you getting away from science fiction?
It's a combination of both. My first love is probably science fiction, but because of my extensive law enforcement background, and that's one reason why I wrote Jade Eyes, was to try to bring that to the fore, was also to try to bring that reality into my writing, to try to get that out there also. So it's going to be a combination. I've even got a little bit of a kind of a crossover where it's a little bit of a science fiction, but I bring in some law enforcement characters into it, to try to flesh it out and everything, to try to show, hey, this may be a little bit of X-Files, but it's something based on realism.
Well, you mentioned Jade Eyes. Why don't you tell us about that? What is the whole premise, and how much of it, this is going to be released very soon, isn't it?
This week, it should be up on Amazon, and I'm getting some hard copies. And here in the very near future, there's going to be an audio version also of it. So luckily, I'm working with a publisher, Blue Forge, that has helped me be able to create an audio version to start out with the short stories, but also it's going to be coming out with Jade Eyes. I literally, with Jade Eyes was, I based it on my experiences over in Homeland Security investigations in Seattle. I retired from there in 2008. And it's from a young female agent's perspective, and I cheated because I took 2 young women that were new agents that were just kick-ass agents, and I combined them into one character. It's that story about this young agent getting involved with this human trafficking investigation, but it also involves a love story which unfortunately turns kind of dark. And I don't want to go too much into detail, but it does get into the whole idea of, which happens a lot in law enforcement and people maybe don't realize. Sometimes because of who you are and the job you do, sometimes people try to use you. And sometimes you wind up getting into odd situations because of your job and who you are. And so that's what I was kind of looking into, and also explaining how the bureaucracy works. Because one of the biggest problems I see with a lot of police thrillers and stuff like this, especially on television, they kind of gloss over all that. Sometimes they'll throw a little bit in there here and there. The best series I ever saw that actually showed long-term police experience and activity was when HBO did that long series called The Wire, about wiretaps and this long-term investigations. They actually hit it on the mark about the fact that you have these long-term investigations, boring as hell sometimes. You're sitting out late at night on surveillance, you've got cameras up, you've got wiretaps, and eventually, slowly but surely, something happens and you start putting 2 and 2 together, And then you finally go down and you get all the warrants you need, and then you do kick the doors in, and then you got to court. And then you got to take everybody to court, and maybe everything goes south there. And people I don't think, understand that. But at the same time, quite often, during that whole experience, sometimes you make mistakes as a law enforcement officer. Sometimes you get in situations that you really weren't looking for. And so that's kind of what I tried to work into the whole story also.
You mentioned the audiobook. I understand you did do work on one story of yours as an audiobook. What is that experience like for a writer who's used to working with words on a page, and then you have to present those same words in an audio presentation?
I went ahead and did the audio version for the new short story book. Luckily, my publisher is helping me find a young lady who's going to do the audio book for Jade Eyes, because the protagonist is female, and so we figured it would be more interesting if a female was reading, the characters. But the oddest thing is, you'll be reading along, and all of a sudden you hit a word, and you can't pronounce it. You wrote it, but trying to get your mouth to form it into that little thing, and you go, okay, rewind, do it again. Take 2, take 3. There's a couple, I'll have to admit I cheated a couple times in my short story book. I was having so much trouble pronouncing a word, I just pronounced the pronunciation. I just went ahead and changed the word in the audio version, because I couldn't get my mouth to do it right and make it sound right. So that in of itself, I guess, would be an experience for an author. And I think everybody should, at one time or another, try to read their own books too. Some people say that if you read your books out loud, you'll suddenly notice, well, why did I say that way? Which is true to a certain extent. But I will have to admit that what I try to do well before I ever get to that point is I keep going over and over and over and over again, trying to figure out, is that going to be, especially with conversations and dialogue, is that the way that people I know would really talk? Or is that the way that the character that I wrote would actually talk?
One of the things I know you mentioned many times is that the conflict between show or tell. And you're, as a person who, how much time do we have that we can go on to this one? The writing is a telling where the videos are showing, and audio is somewhere in between. Okay, how do you answer to that?
Okay, show, don't tell. Okay, I took writing courses like back in the 70s. Nobody mentioned that. Show, don't tell is, as far as I'm concerned, a hackneyed phrase that came over from Hollywood because they want you to write books they can turn into scripts. Okay, I've written some scripts. Script writing is different than book writing. Sorry, people, there's a difference. Some people are really good at writing scripts, and some people are really good at writing books. And then when they try to do the opposite, they don't do a good job. We are, like I said earlier, we are storytellers, okay? If you want to say that I don't like your book because of X, Y, Z, that's fine. But if all you can say is, well, you're not showing, you're just telling, you're not giving me the specifics on what you find fault with my books. That is just something you're throwing in my face, which tells me that what you're really asking for is you want to have a bunch of explosions. You want to have a bunch of really quick things happen that you want to see like a video game. You know, you want that instantaneous gratification rather than actually delve in the story and read it. So I always get irritated when people say, well, you're supposed to do show, don't tell. No, I want to just write a good story.
How can a book club or a writing group get in touch with you?
Well, of course, you can get a hold of us through Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers. I'm the one that usually runs around on the Facebook posting stuff. Also, I can be reached at Glockmark 10mm at AOL.com. As you can tell, I'm a dinosaur because I still have AOL. But also, if you contact and go on to the Blue Forge group sites or blueforgepress.com also, you'll be able to find my works.
Mark, thank you so much for being here today. It was just such a pleasure to
Well, thank you,
actually
Janice.
talk
You didn't
and
shake my
review.
hand when we started out.
Oh, I'll have to do that for the next one. I'll have to do that. I look forward to our continued endeavors with you in conjunction with CLAW. I would like to thank all of our viewers for tuning in to Bremerton Kitsap Access Television and viewing this Kitsap Literary Artists and Writers production. With the fall, there will be numerous events and bazaars and reading activities with authors and artists. These are opportunities to meet personally with all of them. BCAT is also programming some special holiday events with CLAW. I wish to thank the BCAT staff on cameras and the director's chair. Our broadcasts are scheduled for Saturday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific Time on Wave Cable Channel 3 and Comcast Channel 12. The CLAW program is also currently scheduled for Wednesday mornings at 9 o'clock a.m. Pacific Time. Keep in touch with our Facebook pages to discover where you can meet local authors and artists. We hope everyone has a pleasant evening, a productive and fascinating week, and you will read or listen to a good book this week. Until Saturday, I am J.W. Capek with the CLAW and conjunction with Bremerton Kitsap Access Television. Good evening.